The bald head support group.
I never saw you without your hat on. I didn't even fully know that you were bald.
I feel like maybe I'd need a podcast with my hat off, but I'll be uncomfortable the whole time. So, no.
Oh, wait a minute. There can only be one bald guy in the podcast. You got to cover it.
You know, the us bald guys, we got to stick together, you know. I wasn't going to, I'll have you heard my dad joke about bald heads?
No.
So God makes two types of heads. Mm-hmm. Perfect ones, and then the rest he covers with hair.
There you go.
See, there we go. All right.
I got another one that I wouldn't put on tape, but it's.
Now I feel like I need to hear it. We'll save it for after.
Okay.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael DeLisser. I'm so excited. It's been probably actually almost about exactly a year.
Almost exactly.
Since we last talked.
Because I met you at the conference.
Yeah.
And then we did it shortly after that.
Right. So
yeah.
I don't know the exact timing of it. But so if everybody's listening, we had a conversation about a year ago, which was awesome. And so I'm excited for, for phase 2 of it. I've got the, kind of the intro teed up for you. But basically the best way I could explain you, and I'll probably butcher this, well, concisely, the way I would do it is that you're a communications expert. You're a leadership and communications expert. The most notable thing that we get to add now is that you're an author, which is going to be really fun for us to talk about and dig into. I want to start with that a little bit, if you don't mind humoring me, but just kind of you were talking to me about it off camera, about kind of the journey of writing your new book and how long it took and stuff like that. Do you mind just kind of resharing some of that story now that I'm talking to, Michael DeLisser, the author, which is exciting to say, but talk me through kind of that journey and the timeline of the book.
Yeah. And quite honestly, it's exciting to hear you refer to me as an author, because that's the first time I've heard someone say that. And this book was 15 years in the making. It was actually longer than 15 years, but a little history. So back in 1999, my dad wrote a book called Be Your Own Executive Coach, right? And I was much earlier in my career than he let me help him out by giving him some editing ideas and things like that. But it was exciting to help him with that. And then fast forward, I think it was roughly around 2010 or so, he started to show signs of Alzheimer's. And I was like, you know what? One of the coolest things I could do is write a book with him, And so, and at that point, I was still pretty early in my career, but I had learned a lot, and I was pretty good at what I did, And so I ended up starting the process with him, and I started to recognize at that point that his Alzheimer's was far enough along that he wasn't going to be able to contribute in the way I had imagined.
Right.
So at that point, I kind of lost my momentum around it. My motivation was to do it with him. And I realized that he was giving me feedback on editing and things like that are, muscle memory from when he was an English major, but he wasn't able to help. So I put it down, and then periodically over the last 15 years, I was motivated to pick it up and put it down again. But, knowing I could do it anytime I wanted, and jobs changed, and, life happens. And then it wasn't until about a year and a half ago, and I had most of it written, but a year and a half, and actually it was like little over 2 years ago, I was in a position where I was going into business on my own, and I'm like, you know what, now's the time to have a book, because people don't know who I am and my background and what I can bring to the table. So then I really brought it across the finish line. And I'm so glad that it was 15 years later, because I am so much better at what I do now than I used to. There's so many lessons I learned over the years. And even, hearing you say, you're a communication expert, I don't think when people say they're an expert, it's like you've arrived at a destination. And the way I look at it is I'm constantly learning, I'm trying to learn more and more about being an expert in communication. But I always see that as just over the horizon, because the minute you stop trying, you don't, keep growing. I don't want it to be designating myself as an expert.
Right.
I'm pretty knowledgeable.
I'll call you an expert.
You can do that. But for me, my goal is to always keep stretching my knowledge and keep getting better. And over the 15 years, I've been able to do that. And that's why the book, I think, is way better now than it would have been 15 years ago.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a blessing and obviously, a bummer with with your dad and, that, but it is interesting to know, like, I don't know, somehow things always kind of work out the way they're supposed to work out, and now there's, while the initial charge for it, evolved, but the expertise grew, the experience grew, the stories, the anecdotes, all of that stuff. I mean, I don't know. It's interesting it's just crazy how how stuff like that works out.
Well, and when my dad wrote his book, I think he was in his 60s, you know, and for me, if I had done it much earlier, I mean, his book was as good as it was because he had so many years, you know, to put into it. And just for me, it's the same thing. I mean, I think the longer you have to think about, and then I got to go back and look at the stuff I wrote and say, whoa, I could do way better than this, you know, so.
Right.
Yeah.
How many and I'm going to get to the meat of it here, but I'm just curious about the process a little bit. Like, how many iterations of it, or I don't know. I don't know you perfectly well, obviously, but I know you well enough to know that, I don't know, you take a lot of pride in your work, and there's a lot of, I mean, you're a communications expert, but you know, I could see like calling it done being a really challenging moment, you know, like it kind of walked me through that, like the finishing line of it, and just what the experience was like for you.
There was 3 different calling it dones that happened.
That's what
I thought it was done until I put it in front of my reviewers, that I realized it was not done. In fact, this is actually 1/3 of the original book that I wrote.
Oh, wow.
And the feedback I got from the initial reviewers was, this is way too much to try to cover in one book, you know? And so then I broke it into pieces and said, okay, I'll do the piece that's just about, you know, increasing self-awareness and your interpersonal communication skills. I had a whole nother chapter about, a whole nother half of it was about what I call the communication core 4, which is the 4 skills that leaders have to develop in order to be effective. And that's presentation skills, meeting management, one-on-one coaching skills, and writing skills. Right?
There could be a whole book on that.
There is a whole book that it's already written. I just have to turn it into a book eventually.
There we go. Cool. Yeah.
But in any case, and then I put it in front of my actual editor. And then, you know, when you have a really good editor, it is an amazingly humble experience to see all the markings on your work. And you start to realize, and we're going to talk about personality, but my personality is to give too much information, and it's tied to personality preferences.
Right.
Too much information and jumping around a little bit too much. All my reviewers said that, and then my editor, you know, made me realize that I am way detailed in my writing style. So when you put it all together, there was a few edits that happened, and I'm really happy that I took the time to go out and find reviewers that think opposite than me, take their feedback and incorporate it, and then actually get an editor that made it look even better. So it's
fascinating, and because it sounds like most of those revisions were, you know, down the path of conciseness, you know, organization and conciseness. One of the things we do a lot of here is branding and design work. And our designer's famous for saying that a good design is not when there's nothing left to add; it's when there's nothing left to take out. Like, it's like there's nothing else for us to remove from it. Like, that's when, you know, we know. And I just relate a little bit to that of the, you know, the conciseness of it.
And when we get into the discussion about personality, I'll talk about how I was able to leverage my personality strengths in the book, but also able to leverage other people's strengths to help me fix the areas that needed fixing.
Yeah.
So,
seems like good leadership traits.
I try.
Talk to me about that. Let's dive into the personality. The personality side of it. And before we do real quick, but leadership accelerators.
Yeah.
Tell me about that at a high level. What's the concept of a leadership accelerator?
Sure. Over the years that I've been coaching executives one-on-one and custom building leadership development programs, I've learned that there are certain things that cause you to accelerate your success as a leader, right? And majority of them are tied to communication skills. There's plenty of leaders that technically are great at what they do, and we talked about this a little bit in the last podcast, you know, the Peter Principle, where people get promoted to their highest level of incompetence, which essentially means people get promoted beyond their capability to have the communication skills to be successful at that level. And so that was kind of the underlying kind of driver that made me discover. I'm sorry, I lost the question.
Well, and I'm going to bounce. This is why we. Why we get along so well, because we're going to just be bouncing around everywhere. But I love it because, well, simultaneously, that idea of being promoted beyond the level of you know, their communication skills is simultaneously terrifying and reassuring.
Yeah.
You know, like, none of us know what we're doing is kind of reassuring.
Yeah.
And then it's also terrifying because none of us know what we're doing,
right,
you know, on a real level.
And you just reminded me what the question was, why accelerators, right?
Yes.
So one of the things that I realized that would accelerate careers is people becoming really aware of their communication habits and where their strengths are and where their weaknesses are. And that was one of the three pieces. The second one, where I see people really having a high awareness of their personality preferences, how they're different from others, and how they can respond to others to meet the needs of others as well. That was the second one. And the third one is emotional intelligence. I mean, the higher you go in an organization, if you are not growing your emotional intelligence, you are going to run into trouble sooner or later. Daniel Goleman, who is kind of the father of emotional intelligence, his research showed that the higher you go in the organization, eventually you get to a point where your communication skills are twice as important as your technical skills.
Wow.
And your success as a leader.
Yeah.
And that's really what emotional intelligence is. So
it makes so much sense.
Yeah.
I mean, I even think about, my little microscopic company, but I love it when I get to the point where I don't know what my team is doing, like tactically wise. You know what I mean? Like if I had to physically do any number of the things that we do, I wouldn't know the first thing about it. But then it's because which it wasn't the case when we started it. Like when we started the company, operators and we were doing the work and selling the work and invoicing for it was all happening at the same time, and kind of how that evolves. And then you realize that now the priority is like client communication and team communication and keeping people motivated and stuff, and it shifts, which is fascinating to me.
Well, and if you think about your experience you just explained, with each bit of growth, your role became more and more dependent on your ability to get results through others. Right. And so with each promotion, it's less about you doing the work and more about getting others to be able to help, achieve that technical work.
Yeah.
Right? And so with each promotion, your communication skills become more and more important. And that's why your ability to have high emotional intelligence becomes more important too, because you're dependent on being able to get results through others. And if you can't detect and respond to the needs of others emotionally, then you're going to struggle. So
let's stay on that path for a little bit, because I'm fascinated with the whole concept of emotional intelligence. Mm-hmm. It's one of those things, because I'm curious your take on it. I feel like I've been lucky in the sense that I have a high degree of emotional intelligence intuitively.
Yeah.
It sounds to me though like it's something that can be learned. Absolutely. Tell me about that.
So when you look at, and just to clarify for whoever's listening, what we're referring to when we say emotional intelligence. So it's the original model that was put forward by Daniel Goleman, identified 4 key areas of emotional intelligence. One is self-awareness. Are you aware of your own emotional reactions, how you come across to others, what your strengths are, those kind of things. The second one is self-management or self-control. And so it's one thing to know that. It's a whole nother thing to be able to manage yourself in those emotional situations, or be able to leverage your strengths and minimize your weaknesses in those situations. Those are the 2 self-focused areas of emotional intelligence. The other 2 areas are other-focused. One is social awareness, your ability to read and see the emotional needs and or just communication needs of others. And then the fourth one is relationship management. So it's one thing to be able to spot what other people's need. It's a whole nother to be able to communicate in a way and form strong relationships with them and respond to their needs in a way that meets their needs.
See, and that opens up a whole new thought track for me, because I've always conceptualized emotional intelligence as the others, not as. So you're telling me I've got to be aware of myself too?
I'll take it a step further. I'll take it a step further. If you are not self-aware, you are going to struggle to be aware of others, right? Because you have to know how you're coming across and able to respond to someone else's needs. And if you don't have self-awareness, you're going to say and do things that are either going to piss them off, or it's going to be the wrong thing to say at the wrong time. And so it all starts with self-awareness, and then you build on that. And once you know where your strengths are, you can leverage them in that conversation. And once you know where your vulnerabilities are and where you're most likely to make a mistake, you can respond in a way that works around it. And then you can respond to others. So a lot of people think, it's about really responding to others. It is, but to respond to others, you have to have self-awareness.
You have to understand yourself
and
first.
Self-control.
Yeah. So walk me through the self ones again. It's self-awareness and then
self-management.
Self-management. Yeah. So you got to be aware of yourself and your traits and your tendencies.
Correct.
And then you've got to have control of them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Got it.
2 very different things.
Right.
And so, all of us have been in situations where we were triggered by something, right? And we may even know what the patterns are, that what's going to trigger us. The key is, in that moment of triggering, can you catch yourself before you say or do something that you're going to regret later, and have an alternative way of responding or that will allow you to have a better outcome.
Tell me more about that. So one of the things I've been working on, and I don't, this is why I love having conversations like this, because you help me with the vocabulary for it, But I've been working on reacting as opposed to responding, responding as opposed to reacting.
Yes.
Because one of the things I'm balancing. So just bear with me for 2 seconds.
No worries.
I'm an emotionally driven guy, as I'm sure you know, and it served me very well most of the time. Because I have a ton of ambition, I'm enthusiastic, I'm an optimist, and I honestly, a lot of the time my energy can outweigh the lack of analysis or whatever else might happen.
Yeah.
There's a downside to that though too. The negative emotions can be just as strong as the positive ones. And so I've been working on that. Responding rather than reacting. And you mentioned something there that I'm curious about, of like so much of the emotional intelligence and the self-awareness piece, and recognizing what's triggering you, and then, managing yourself on your responses or how you behave or whatever it might be. Do you have any guidance or tips, for myself or anybody listening? But that's such a challenging moment for so many people, because another way to describe it would be that you're asking somebody to make a logical decision in an emotional state. And how do you bridge that gap? Like what are some I don't know, just some tips or tricks, or, assuming you've got that self-awareness piece, bridging it to the self-management, side of it. What's your perspective on that?
Well, you hit on the key thing there, right? You have to get out of the emotional state in order to be able to respond logically and rationally, right? And so, the brain has a defense mechanism that kicks in, and when you feel like you need to protect yourself, whether you feel like it's a real threat or not, it might be that, when you're in a situation where you're in danger, your body kicks in and you go into survival mode. Now, sometimes we perceive danger based on our history or whatever, and it may not be real.
Right.
But either way, it triggers us emotionally. And when we get triggered, it's very hard to finish that conversation in a way that you would want to, because now your emotions have kicked in and you're in survival mode, right? So the most important thing you could do is figure out what triggers you. And to your point, tips, right? Who are the people that know you the best?
Right.
Because they will tell you what triggers you, because they've seen it happen enough times, right? And so increasing your self-awareness. So I make a distinction when I teach this, is there's a difference between self-perception and self-awareness. Self-perception is what we think we know about ourselves. Self-awareness is what other people verify that they see as also being, who we are. And so when you go out and you think this is your trigger, when you talk to other people, they may actually say, actually, that's not what it is. Here are some other things. It gets you thinking about it. So getting to true self-awareness involves getting feedback from others. And you have to get that feedback to make sure that your perception of yourself matches what other people are seeing.
Right. So then you move from self-perception to self-awareness.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is fascinating too. There was a stat that you mentioned that I think it's like 95% of people think they're self-aware, but only 10 to 15% actually are. Yeah,
that's one of the research studies that I referred to in the book, and it's fascinating, but it turns out to be very true, right? And I've done 360 reviews with many people, and there's some leaders that really get it, and most of the time you hear some surprises, right? Around, wow, I didn't realize where people are perceiving me that way, and the reality is that we all have blinders on, right? I mean, the way we see the world is based on our experiences, and there's kind of, we'll talk more about this when we get into personalities, but there's multiple things that impact how you see yourselves. Some of it is genetic, some of it is life experiences, some of it is, influences from others. But either way, the only way to truly verify that you are being seen by others the same way is to get that feedback. And so what I tell people is go out and start to observe the moments when you are having an emotional reaction. And then if you can't do it right then, right after, stop and say, what was it in that situation that triggered me?
Yeah.
Right? And so you could go back and look at the last 4 or 5 times you got angry, or the last 4 or 5 times something triggered you. Was there anything in common in those situations?
Right.
It may be you felt like your identity was being threatened, right? When someone was saying your work isn't good enough, right? It might be that it was the way somebody said something, right? And maybe it triggered something from your past that made you think you were in that same situation again, and it was a bad situation with a bad role model, something like that. But there's all sorts of different things you can do to start to develop an understanding of the patterns that trigger you. And once you know what those patterns are, then you can go about figuring out, how do I prevent myself from getting triggered in that situation?
Right. Yeah. And mine is sometimes even, like, I'm sure I have, 100 triggers like everybody else in the world, but some of mine are self-inflicted.
Oh yeah.
I jump to assumptions. Mm-hmm. Like I make assumptions, and then I get all spun out and frustrated. And half the time, probably actually most of the time, they're not even true.
Right.
Like there wasn't even a problem to begin with, and I just make assumptions and jump to conclusions and whatever. And so anyway, I'm working on that. So I'm fascinated with that of just learning those, because that is, I think there's an argument, I think, that if that might be, if you had to pick one skill to master, it'd be noticing when those emotional moments occur and then figuring out how to have the logical response to it, because it's so hard to pull yourself out of an emotional state.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, as leaders, right? And the target audience of the book is leaders. So leaders in general, people watch how you react to everything. Mm-hmm. And so if a change is happening, if you are responding with stress and you are responding with emotion, you're going to cause that kind of reaction across the organization.
Oh, yeah, of course.
If you respond with calmness and you keep your rational thinking ahead of it, then other people will start to say, it can't be that bad because they're doing okay with it.
Right.
So you set the tone for the organization as a leader. You set the tone for your team. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a leader, when a major change was coming, react poorly, and then when the change did happen, they spend a lot of time having to clean up their team's perceptions about the change when they actually come to a point of realizing the change is a good thing.
Right.
Because they've kind of poisoned their team on, this is terrible and we need to, push back on it. And then once they realize it's there to stay and they have to go forward, then I'm thinking of one leader in particular where he said, I wish I understood this at the beginning of this change. I would have completely talked to my team differently.
Right.
I just didn't understand the value of it, right? And he allowed himself to get triggered in that moment, and it caused him to create triggering in his team as well.
Yeah, and what a good point to remember for any leader, that your team's paying attention to how you respond to everything.
Yeah.
Good, bad, indifferent. And there's probably, even just being aware of that, and then you can be intentional about it. Because, for me, I would love to pump up the good more.
Yeah.
And, not show the stress as much. You know what I mean? Keep the energy up when needed.
Yeah.
But more level-headed, when it could potentially be the downswing of that too. And I think there's just such an important takeaway from it, is that they're observing. You're saying a lot with how you reply, with how you react to situations, even if you're not using your words.
Yeah. And you also have to read the room, right? And this goes to the second half of emotional intelligence, which is that social awareness, right? And the ability to manage relationships. Because to your point, I'm the same way with, I want to always look at the positive side of change. But the reality is you first have to acknowledge where people are at.
Yeah.
And if they're not there with you, you've got to point out, you understand the pain, you understand the challenges, you understand their concerns, and you can help create a vision of how we get beyond them and get to them. But you do have to acknowledge people where they're at, or they think you're disconnected. Right. And so it's a balancing act of giving people hope, giving people a path forward, but acknowledging them where they're at as well.
Yeah, you can't just have blind optimism.
No.
Darn it.
No, you can. It just may not work out the way you want.
Fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's so awesome.
But to that point, I see leaders doing that, and on occasion, it really creates problems, because it makes them look detached from reality, and there's a balancing.
Yeah, I was about to shift gears, but I actually want to hear a little bit more about that balancing, act of it. It sounds like the idea would be acknowledgement, information gathering, like a little bit of a reality check.
Yeah,
and then maybe that's the place for the optimism or the positive, the glass half full perspective, right?
Yeah, and I think the key is making a deliberate point to acknowledge the feelings of others before you move forward with whatever you're going to do. So, if you want to paint that picture of the future, you have to first say, look, I hear what you're saying. I hear that you're upset about the change. I hear that you don't fully understand it and all that, and completely understandable at this point, right? And so what I'm going to do is try to help you understand why this change is going to benefit all of us. And even though it may be difficult in the short run, in the long run, we're going to be able to achieve this, this, and this. So,
yeah.
But if you don't take the time to acknowledge where they're at first, they won't feel listened to. And what inevitably happens down the road is if you don't acknowledge people where they're at the time of the change, they'll never fully embrace it, or they'll still, years later be talking about the fact that they weren't listened to back when it happened.
Right, right. Yeah, and it's such an important thing to remember, too, because I've got a tendency sometimes of being – it's funny because I've been very open about it with my team because I'm a problem solver. Yeah. Like I justify it as thinking that that's me being a good leader. I'm solving people's problems. Like I like to be needed. I'm jumping in and I'm solving the problem. And what I'm learning is that is skipping that first step of like the acknowledgement, the fact finding, the learning thing. And sometimes it's not even the right solution and it can backfire, which like there was a very recently, so we've got a big part of our business is video production. Mm-hmm. And we've had some challenges in that department. There's been some turnover with employees and, it's just been one of those things. And we finally had a very strong employee in place, and she got, the dream job, lifetime of, had to leave. And we're so excited for her and whatever. And Lou might even still be here right now. But the dynamic is that our content team has to work really closely with our video team. Mm-hmm. And this moment, this change, as you talk about, had so many potentials to be catastrophic. Like if we, if I would have freaked out, or if it was like a critical moment thing. And it was so fun because I got to see how that exact approach that you just described can work. Mm-hmm. It was more of, hey, I don't know what the solution is going to be yet. There's multiple paths we can take. Yeah. And what it did is it opened up a dialogue for creative thinking and like other perspectives that I hadn't considered. And, workflow all these other things that I never would have thought of. And what's been really cool of it is that the outcome was that we didn't replace that person. Instead, we've partnered with a company that specializes in it. Yeah. And so we're contracting with them. And man, it's been fun. It's been more smooth. The quality's gone up, and it's just been. And it's one of those examples of like, as I'm learning, an earlier version of myself probably would have panicked and hired the first person that applied to fill the seat and keep the train on the tracks. Right. And anyway, it's just a powerful illustration of exactly what you're describing of like acknowledging how impactful it is to the rest of the team, and then having some moment for the other insights and the other ideas. And it was so cool because it set us all up for success, myself included. Yeah. Because had I just jumped right to it.
And there are key moments where it's critical that leaders get it right. And I'll give you an example. There was a company I worked for. We had just lost our biggest client, and it was a giant client, a couple 100,000 employees, right? And so everyone was freaked out. And I was doing a leadership retreat, and we had 40 leaders in the room, and the CEO came into the room. And no one had a chance to talk to him yet about losing this biggest client, and everyone was sitting there at the edge. The first question they asked him was, what are your thoughts about losing the biggest client? And you knew everyone was listening because they're all worried about their jobs, and and the way he handled it was amazing. He said, without even hesitating, he says, it all depends on whether you saw that client as a vital organ or a cancerous tumor. Mm. And everyone was kind of like shocked by that. And he said, I personally saw them as a cancerous tumor. And then he went on to explain how that giant client was sucking all of our resources away from our other clients. And we were losing other clients because our second biggest client left to go somewhere else. And he said, and so he went on to say, look, it's going to be hard initially, but I think it's better for the organization as a whole. Within months, that second biggest client came back to us because the big client went away and then they were going to be the big dog.
Right.
So, and that client was not nearly as demanding, and it did turn out to be better for the organization. But at that key moment when he had everyone listening, he had just the right thing to say.
Yeah.
And he reframed it for everybody by making that. And we all kind of laughed at first, but then when he went on to describe, we're like, wow, that client did really suck all of our resources, and this is probably a good thing.
Right.
Going into the meeting, nobody thought that.
Yeah, and then there's all this uncertainty, insecurity, and yeah, I mean, talk about like that critical, that critical moment. And then what a powerful moment too of like taking something that could have been catastrophically negative.
Yep.
And now you've got a whole team of people that are confident and understand some of these higher level complexities of the business.
Yeah.
Like the opportunity cost of having that client.
Yeah.
We had a client a while back that we literally made a swear jar for. And I'm like, if we say their name again, you're putting $1 in the jar. And it took a ton of courage. I ended up very tactfully ending the relationship with them, which for me was super. Well, it was terrifying because, I mean, we're only a few years old. I mean, probably by most definitions, we're still a startup.
Yeah.
And every dollar of revenue matters. But it's similar to what you're explaining, is it's just like that. Well, it's that other communication, right? So like on one hand, we're making a joke about the swear jar and then I took it on me to have the communication with the client to end it. But what it signaled to the rest of the team is that I respect them enough to not have to have that headache anymore. Mm-hmm. And that I'm confident in us enough to know that we're going to replace it. Like that we'll be fine.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because like that's why I love talking to you, because I love being able to put the words to these concepts.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And like actually understand. Is science the right word for it? Understand the science behind it. Yeah, I think that's a fair.
Well, and it's part of why I'm glad I didn't write this book until now, because that example I just gave you, it wasn't there when I started writing the book, and over the years I've gathered so many examples that illustrate these concepts that they make it easier to absorb. And right now, massive change is what every company's going through.
Yeah.
They don't have a choice, right? AI is changing the world, the rapid change of technology. And so we're going to probably keep referring back to change in this podcast, because there's no company that is not experiencing massive change.
Literally.
Yeah. And if they're not, then they're probably not going to be around long.
For perspective, a quick anecdote, but I'm going to the Lawn and Landscape Tech Expo in Vegas in July. Mm-hmm. We do a lot of work for home services businesses. So anyway, it's a good group for me to be a part in. But even the agenda at a landscaping conference has a ton of AI topics.
Yeah.
I mean, just to reiterate your point that literally every single organization change is and that's probably. You know more than I do on that front, and it's so fun. We got to dive in a little bit to communicating change, and communication through organizational change and stuff like that. But I mean, change is there's that saying that the only constant is change, but it's probably accelerated now.
Big time.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's much faster than it used to be. And it's going to get faster and even more. And that's why that's why emotional intelligence is so important, is everybody is stressed to a level that they haven't been before.
Right.
Because the changes are happening faster and faster, and they're having to adapt. So it's not like, hey, we made it through the change. Okay, we can chill now. No, the next change is coming.
It's already here. Yeah.
And so everybody's a little more emotionally on edge. And for leaders, you have to be able to help people manage that. And change doesn't have to be stressful. If you manage it well and you create in people's minds, it's all about how they perceive the change. If they see it as, oh no, this is going to be stressful, then it's going to be stressful. If they think this is a great opportunity for me to develop my career in a new way, it's an opportunity for me to learn a new skill. If you can plant those seeds in people's minds and help them see the value of it, then change becomes less stressful and they get excited going in.
Right.
And that's the emotional piece. If you know that people are stressed and scared, if you can turn that into excitement and momentum moving forward, that's when you start to really demonstrate your ability to manage others, demonstrating your own social awareness and ability to help others.
Right. Yeah. And I love, and my huge takeaway on that one though is that it has to start with yourself.
Yes.
Dang it.
Yeah.
No,
because we're going through the same emotions they are. We just have to get ours. We have to have ours
in check. Yeah.
Before we start taking it on with them.
Right. Speaking of that, I wanted to talk about the personality preferences.
Yeah.
And you talk about it in depth, but just talk to me about how we've touched a ton about communication. Obviously, it's kind of the underlying tone of your work and your book and all of our conversations, which I love so much. And then there's this emotional intelligence component of it, and I say it in tongue in cheek, but very sincerely. Like so many of those self-awareness and self-management things, I don't know, are at least auxiliary related to personality traits.
Yes.
Talk to me about how just unpack the whole idea of personality preferences, as it relates to this accelerator concept, because I'm just curious about it.
Yeah, and in the book, I identified 3 accelerators, right? And these are things that help leaders accelerate their career success. The emotional intelligence is probably the biggest all-encompassing one, and you can almost argue that the other 2 are almost subsets of it.
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to articulate. You nailed it there. But the personality is so tied into to the emotional intelligence bit.
So to your question, one big piece of self-awareness is understanding how you come across to others depending on your personality preferences, right? And so we all have personality preferences, and we have, no personality type is good or bad.
Define personality preference for me quickly. You meaning about people we work with, on the other side of the table, our relationships or ourselves?
And so what I'll get into a little bit of the science behind personality types, right? And it's all based on the work of Carl Jung. He was the original creator of almost every personality tool out there is based on his research. So he identified some key differentiators in people in terms of what gets them kind of motivated, what are the things that they need based on personality. But they basically broke it into a couple of categories. One is introversion versus extroversion, right? And that's pretty straightforward. Everyone understands the difference between those.
Yep.
The other one is task focus versus people focus. So when you take extroversion and task focus, what you get is a results-driven personality type. And that is the person they don't want the details, they just want bottom line, what needs to be done, right? They're focused on what questions, what needs to be done, what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve. Keep in mind that that's one of the 4 types, but nobody is just that. That just might be the one they lead with, right? Then when you combine extroversion with people focus, then you get more of a people person, right? And that's the enthusiastic, high energy. You describe yourself that way, so I think you probably have a lot of that. Then on the other side, you have 2 different personality types that are more introverted. The introverted task focus, when you combine those 2 things together, they tend to be more structured, and they like to have procedures and process and things like that. And then the last one is introverted and people focus. And when you put those 2 together, a lot of times you get people that are driven, they're understanding and or meaning driven. They want to know the purpose behind things. They ask lots of why questions. So when you put the 4 on a team, and when we start talking about why teams really need to understand what they're leveraging and what they're not in personality types. If you have a team that is all results driven, they're going to be great at moving forward and getting things done. But you need the people person to ask who needs to be involved in this, because the people person's focused on the who, right? You need the people that are lead with the structured energy. They ask how questions. So it's like, okay, what do we need to get done? Who needs to be involved? How are we going to get there? The 4th one, which is introversion and people focus, they're going to ask why. They're going to say, wait a minute, why are we even doing this? What's the meaning behind it? What's the purpose? And so what happens is when a team is too heavy with, say, structure and results driven, you get a really high task focus. They get stuff done, but they forget to get people on board because they don't have any of the people thing going, right? If you have people that are mostly leaning with the people energies, those other 2, then they'll get everyone excited about the change, but they won't be good at implementing it and being structured in how they do it.
So, I feel attacked. No, I'm kidding.
Hey, when I do personality tests, my lowest score is structure all the time, and if I don't work really hard at it, it will show up in my work.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. Or in my case, I've got a business partner that complements it. Thank goodness.
Yeah.
They can figure out how now to define that and put it into process, and so it's fascinating.
A big part of understanding and developing your self-awareness is knowing which of these energies are the ones that you lead with, and maybe which is the one that you use the least, because those are going to be the ones that are most noticeable.
And everyone has at least some level of all four?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. In fact, everyone has the ability to demonstrate all four.
Got it.
Right? And so I'll give you a great example. I design training for a living, and I deliver training for a living. So my two dominant personality types are the people ones, right? The one that's more understanding driven, and the one that's more kind of people focused. When I design trainings, it's really fun, and I'm pretty good at engaging people. I'm pretty good at explaining the why behind things to make sure they fully understand it. But I also tend to over-explain, because I'm really trying to get them to understand it. Where I struggled early in my career was because of my lack of structure. I was getting feedback constantly in my reviews of my training. You didn't even follow your own agenda. You jumped all over the place, right? And so I realized my weakest one was structure. And if I didn't do something to pump up my structure in my training, I was going to keep losing the people that lead with the structure energy.
Right.
If I didn't cut down on the detail, I was going to lose the people that lead with results energy.
Right.
And so essentially what it came down to was I had to learn to become very structured and very results driven when I deliver training and when I design it. And one of the ways I did that was I would go to people that I knew had those as strengths, and I put my training in front of them, and they'd be like, yeah, you're covering way too much information and you're doing way too many touchy-feely things, and you're not being focused on the outcomes, right?
I love that not only you seeked out, well, it's very self-aware of you, but I love that not only did you seek feedback, but it intentionally sought feedback from people with those complementing or different personality traits, personality preferences.
Right. And so, but I was able to do that because I had self-awareness, right? I had gotten enough feedback in my career that told me, you suck at structure.
Right.
And because of that, you need to surround yourself with people who can help you overcome that weakness or vulnerability.
Right. It's so funny and relevant. So we're scaling. Like we're in hyper growth mode right now, and it's so exciting. It's super fun, and I get emotionally charged from it. I have those other, that bucket of the personality trait there. But one of the critical parts about us scaling is that we follow process we've got this new system that we're using, and I've been very open with it with my team that I need them to hold me accountable because it's so hard for me to remember that I've got to go in and do this thing, the process, thing. I've got to upload my notes into it and check it as I got to go do the thing when I used to get to just send an email. And I don't know. I think it ties into that, like how powerful it can be when there are teams with all of those, with all those different personality traits on them. And when you can recognize where you've got your weaknesses and then pull it in. Yeah. Because honestly, like it could be so tragic if I were just like, you all do it, but I'm in charge. I'm doing it my way. You know what I mean? Yeah. Where instead it's like, no. I understand how important it is. I also understand I'm horrible at it. Right. So help me, hold me accountable, remind me. And literally last week, Ryan, he's our client success manager. You met him today briefly. Mm-hmm. He emailed me at the end of the day, and I could tell that it was like, not knowing exactly how hard and about these things that I needed to finish in our ClickUp system. And I replied with just all caps, thank you for holding me accountable. I'm going to get it done. I'm going to get it done. And I'm so grateful for stuff like that and again, coming back to this idea that that's why I love talking to you, because I don't have the words for it. But when you describe these concepts to me, it's so visual. I get it so clearly. And probably, there's probably those dynamics on every team and in every organization.
Not only are they there, but if you're not aware of where your team's strengths are and where your team personality kind of vulnerabilities are, you will make way more mistakes, and your outcomes will not be nearly as well. It comes down to knowing how to leverage all four of the different personality type, their strengths. And a great example, I do a lot of work with teams that are going through massive change. I regularly see teams that are loaded, and a lot of times it's executive teams, loaded with people that are structured and loaded with people that are of results. Because to be, successful at that level, you have to be able to manage a lot of different things, right? And often I will see when they implement change, more often than not, they do a great job of having a plan. They have a great job of, doing it in an organized way and getting the results that they need initially. But when they don't get people on board along the way, the two people skills, if there's no one on the team that's strong in getting the messaging to help people resonate with the change and why the change is important, when they don't do that, the initial success starts to drop off because people didn't get fully on board and they didn't get excited about it and they didn't see the value of it. The number one reason people resist change is they don't understand the reasoning behind the change. And that's the most common thing that comes up. And so you, like the one energy I was talking about that is understanding driven, the one, I keep saying energy because the tool I use talks about it in terms of it's an energy, the personality preference is an energy. But in any case, when someone doesn't take the time to fully explain the reasoning behind the change and don't take the time to get people to understand how they will benefit, how the customer will benefit, and all that. If you don't say that over and over again during massive change, then people don't fully get on board with it.
Yeah, and I sorry, but I learned the last time we talked that not only do you have to do that, but you have to do it in different ways.
Oh yeah. Yeah, because what happens is when you first announce a change, even if you take the time to explain all that stuff, people are multitasking, they're feeling fear because they hear the change and they're not fully absorbing it. But the research would suggest that you have to repeat those key messages around the benefits of the change and the reasoning for the change at least 7 or 8 times.
Wow. In
multiple different ways if you want it to really resonate.
See, and that's so fascinating. Another quick anecdote, but I'm just like relating this to the real world, to real life. But I mentioned my business partner, and we've got such great complementing strengths. And she's so process driven, and I forget now the exact bucket that described, but it's basically the exact opposite of where I lean in, personality wise. But what'll happen on that front is she'll say, I did roll it out. And then we sent an email a month ago. You know what I mean? So there's the other side of that of like, and I'm glad I'm listening to you here, because there's probably ways that I could complement that effort from the people side. You know what I mean? Like just like the people who are the individuals that are more people heavy on those personality quadrants should probably get help from the process and the why and the communication stuff. Yeah. Vice versa too. So you were explaining that dynamic with most executive boards and how they're, just by nature, the personality traits there, and that so many times there's that gap. What's your kind of advice, or, what would solve that? Is it being aware of the gaps, or do you recommend that there's other stakeholders on, if it's rolling out a change or a communication initiative, or sometimes honestly too, and this is an interesting, sorry that I'm bouncing back and forth, but a lot of my audience is entrepreneurs, and so much of the challenge I think entrepreneurs face is communicating the vision. Yeah. So it's not even necessarily change; it's where we're headed. Yeah. They're these big visionaries, but people don't understand like how massively impactful that could be for them. Yeah. When it happens, so it's a version of change, I suppose. Yeah. Walk me through that, kind of like for somebody that's listening right now, and whether it's a change or a vision, or but those gaps that you had kind of described with generalizing, obviously the executive board. What are ways to mitigate that? When a team is aware of the gaps, they can plan around it. Oh, right? Yeah, of course. So in other words, let's say, and again, if a team hasn't done personality assessments, they may not know what the gaps are, and a lot of companies haven't, but when you create a kind of a team personality assessment and you see everyone on one page and you can see what their preferences are, you can start to recognize where those gaps and where those strengths are, right? And so as you're rolling out any kind of change, you can start to say, okay, you literally stop and say, look, we are great at these other things, but the one we know about ourselves that we're not good at is explaining the why, right? And getting the reasoning behind it. What can we do to make sure that we do a great job of that? Well, it could be going a level down and leveraging people are good at that. It could be just asking everyone on the team to dial it up, right? We all have the ability, like I mentioned earlier. We have. I can be structured when I need to. And it's very draining for me at the end of the day if I've had to be in structure all day.
but I'm
But
capable
when it's
of
important
doing it.
enough, no problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I go into meetings with the executive teams, I'm all about structure and about being results driven, because I know my tendency is to go too long, give too much information, and as it is, they're already being bombarded by too much information. Right.
Right.
So you got to apply the 80-20 rule. I think we may have mentioned that, but that's one of the most important things. What are the 20% of things I could present that'll have the biggest impact?
Right.
And that's
Which
that's
is sorry, finish that.
no, I was just going to say that's more of a results-driven energy, which is again not one of my strengths. But I have to stop and say, okay, instead of giving them all the details, what are the 2 or 3 that mean the most to them? And then I'll give them those 2 or 3. And if they ask for more, I'll give them more. But I'm not going to give them all of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was just going to mention that even for what a good thing to be aware of for organizational communication, whether you're a leader or not. Mm-hmm. Like so many people, need to lead up or manage up, I think is the term, the better term for it. And what you just described right there is exactly why executives want a bullet point email.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? If somebody's listening and they're climbing that ladder and they're working on improving their communication with their manager or their leader, understanding those personality preferences can even help like improve the communication on that level as well.
Yeah. And some of the best employees I've ever had knew what my weaknesses were, and they stepped up and said, hey, make sure you do this.
Yeah.
Right. And it's because we had open discussions about, where my strengths and weaknesses are. I had on a team at one point, my team grew to like 15 people, and I was getting pulled in so many different directions that I wasn't able to effectively do a number of things. But I had one person on my team was super structured, and also one of the most junior people on the team. I actually gave her control of running the meetings of our teams because she was absolutely diligent about making sure the agenda was sent out in advance, which I was forgetting to do because I was pulled in too many directions. She was giving clear, and she would hold me accountable and say, what are we doing in this meeting? What's the purpose? And I'd have to give her the information, and then she'd go execute it. People would come into the meetings more prepared. They knew what was coming. We had more productive meetings, and she kept them running really efficiently because she had a gift that I did not have.
Right.
And me leveraging her gave her a great development opportunity, but it also allowed me to feel relieved that I was doing a better job at managing the.
Yeah.
I was more helping with decision making, but I was letting her run it, and she loved the fact that she had the growth opportunity. I love the fact that I was not having to do something that I sucked at.
Right. A win-win.
Yeah.
No, and there's so much power there. And I think that's one of the biggest things I've learned this year is I've been very open with my team about the stuff I'm working on, like personally, I mean, leadership wise, my weaknesses, my strength, like I'm just like being, I'm just being vulnerable as can be. Like, I'll even state when I'm having a dilemma. Like my instinct is to do this, but I don't think that, what do you guys think? And it's been so cool because I think, and there's nuance there, obviously. I still have to, I'm so confident and still leading the team. Like I'm not flailing in the wind by any means. But it's helping because I touched a little bit on that accountability piece with our new systems. Mm-hmm. But even more so than that, I've got the team is like helping. They're now feeling empowered to hold me to the boundaries that I suck at keeping. Yeah. Because I've been open about the fact that I suck at keeping them. Yep. That I'm too available to our clients, or I'm too responsive, or I get too involved in these things, and I've been telling them very openly that I want to work on that. I want to be better about it, and it's been so fun because now there's been times when they'll be like, "We've got this, go away," and I'm like, "Yes, no problem, thank you," and it's it creates such a healthy dynamic, and I think to your point. It boils down to the foundation of it, awareness. Yeah, and I'll also just point out the things that you're describing are really good things for any leader to be doing, because if you go out and be vulnerable and say, look, this is what I suck at, and you give them invitations to say, hey, if you ever see me not doing well in this area, call me on it. Yeah. Right? And do whatever. And mean it. Yeah, and mean it. And when you give them that, it allows you to become aware when you're not doing it. It also allows you to keep focused on trying to become better at it. Right. And so that's key. A lot of leaders will be like, oh, I have to come across as strong all the time. If you're going to try to come across as strong all the time, you're setting the tone for the team don't show your weakness. Yeah. But if you actually talk openly about where we're all strong and where we all can improve,
we can all help each other by leveraging each other's strengths in different personality areas.
Right.
And that's what a great team does. I mean, a great team, if you're planning a change, you're sitting there saying, okay, do we have the what figured out? Do we have the how figured out? Do we have the who needs to be involved? And we have all the answers to the whys, those 4 different personality needs. And when you do that, you're going to have a much better outcome. When you get people to start to say, hey, I'm good at that. Let me step up and use my strength. And someone else say, I'm not so good at that. Can someone help me out? You create an environment where everyone's offering their vulnerabilities, but they're also stepping up and helping each other to overcome.
Yeah. And then you're creating this tone of like, I don't know. Well, it comes back to that foundation of the self-awareness, the awareness piece, but you're also creating a standard of improvement.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know what I mean? Like we don't have it all figured out.
Yeah.
Not perfect. And I don't know. It just creates such a cool dynamic where it's like, it's got that healthy team dynamic to it. It's letting people lean into their strengths.
Yes.
It's also though opening up the opportunity for people to ask for help where they need it.
Yeah.
Because that just becomes the norm.
Yes.
And it's, again, you're helping me with the words for it, but it's been cool for me to witness, what impacts like that have had. Yeah. So perhaps the concept I'm most fascinated about is, I think you refer to it as cultural communication.
Culturally influenced communication habits.
And then there's some dive in on obviously family and that side of it. I'm absolutely fascinated with it. And one quick anecdote, and then I want you to dive in. But speaking of like culturally influenced communication habits, I was camping with my dad recently this summer. We're sitting around the campfire, and speaking of being self-aware and whatever, he was describing to me that I occasionally can be too controlling. And I was adamant that is not the case. I'm like, there is no.
He was saying that about you?
Yeah.
Okay.
That I can be controlling. And,
this is your grandfather?
My father.
Oh, your father. Okay.
And it was so funny because I was so sure that he was wrong. Like that I am not controlling. I'm easygoing guy or whatever. And that was months ago now, but I've had some pretty good self-awareness and personal growth journey since then. And in fact, I owe him an apology because he nailed it on the head that I am controlling, but I get it from him. Well, that's what's so funny about it. So anyway, to tie in with like the self-awareness piece, and I want to dive in and unpack the culture. Sorry that I'm butchering the terms.
Culturally learned communication habits.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then specifically, I want to dive deep into the family dynamics.
Yeah, and that opens the door to talk about a little bit more about the way I structured the book, because I have found there's a lot of books that give great information, a lot of books that teach theory. The purpose of this book was to give people a self-help guide to increasing their self-awareness about their habits, and we're going to talk about that now, the culturally learned communication habits, but also about their emotional intelligence, about their personality preferences and how that impacts their relationships and how effective they are in their jobs. So every single chapter has activities in it that people can immediately apply and right away learn how to increase their self-awareness and then instantly improve skill in the area where they just learned about. And that was the goal of this book, was to make it so that anybody can take any of these 3 areas, the culturally learned habits that they have, the emotional intelligence, or their personality preferences, and find ways to leverage their strengths and minimize their weaknesses, and give them actual tools and ways to practice.
Action. Yeah.
And so when you look at the comments that I've gotten from different executives that have reviewed the book, they've all been very heavy, where they've said this is a great self-guided way to get people to improve their skill and self-awareness. And that was the goal. I was so happy to see those comments coming in, because my intention was to give people something that just by picking up this book and focus on one thing at a time, you can create that improvement.
Right.
So one of the areas is culturally influenced.
Blame me.
Yeah, you threw me on that. No, it's
culturally influenced communication
habits. Yeah. And so where does that come from? Well, there's a lot of different layers of culture, right? There's the community you grew up in, your family culture, religious culture, right? The country that you're from. I mean, there's so many different influences on your cultural development of your communication habits. The one that probably has the biggest overall influence is the family one. right? And so when you think about it, we grow up with family dynamics that we carry into the workplace, right? Great example, family with 6 kids. At the dinner table, they're all competing for attention, so they all interrupt each other.
Right.
And then they get into the workplace, and when they're competing for attention, they're interrupting others and they're pissing other people off, right? It may have worked in the family, but it's not going to work in the workplace. And so the key is starting to become aware of what are the habits that I have currently. And by the way, some of those habits will be really powerful and helpful in your career. Some of the habits will be really ineffective and hurt your success. And so it's about developing an awareness of what your habits are, leveraging the ones that are strengths and minimizing the ones that are weaknesses.
Yeah.
And so I'll give you a strength of mine. When I was growing up, my mother did not let me lie about anything, right? And there's a story in the book where I talk about this, where I forged a letter and basically, tried to get into school, and they had already called my mom, and she said, yeah, he should be at school, right? And so I got into the principal's office, and basically he said, who wrote this letter? And I was like, I did. And he said, why? He says, because my mom was sleeping and I was running late, and so I told him the truth.
Yeah.
And so long story short, I had a couple incidents like that with this particular vice principal. One of them was going down to the shore with my friends, and my mom wouldn't lie for me. So she wrote a note and basically said, Michael was at the shore enjoying himself with his friends. And he's like, this isn't an acceptable excuse. I'm like, that's the only excuse I have.
That's the only, yeah.
But I said, but my parents won't lie for me. So I'm giving you the truth. And you know that I was down there with other people and their parents did lie for them.
Right.
So if you have to hold me accountable for that, I'll accept it.
No problem. Yeah.
Yeah. He did end up letting me off on that one because he thought it was wrong. But at the same time, when I graduated, he came back and he pulled me aside and he said, I want you to know the one thing I always appreciate about you is you owned up to when you made mistakes or when you did something dumb. And most other students just lied to my face when those situations happen. So thank you for being honest. But between my mother's influence on me and him reinforcing that was a good thing to do, I go into the workplace. When I make a mistake, I say, I screwed up.
Right.
Because early in my life, I had influences and feedback that made me realize it's important to own your mistakes and just deal with the consequences of them. And so, that's one example of a good habit. The other side of that is the interrupting, because I learned because my family used to do that. Or it could be, people treat people differently based on how they watch their parents interacting.
Right.
So many
conflict avoidance.
Yes. If you had seen and observed really bad conflicts growing up, you get in the workplace, you might be afraid of conflict. Right. And that's not necessarily a personality trait, but it is a culturally learned communication thing. So it may be counter to what your personality needs are. If you're results driven, you may want to be direct about things, but if you had a life experience that scared you to do that, then you may not be doing it.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So that's kind of the cultural, that's why it's so important for us to become really aware of the habits we've developed, the good ones and the bad ones, and then learning to leverage the good ones in more situations and learning to minimize the ones that aren't. And the book gives lots of activities. It gives you a chance to do checklists of the most common habits I've seen from executives over the last 20 years. And then you can identify right next to it different ways to work on reducing those habits.
Yeah.
So, that's kind of what I tried to do with that section.
What are some of walk me through some of those habits that you've seen?
Finishing other people's sentences, right? People do that all the time. Sometimes they're doing it from a standpoint, I'm trying to help the other person. The other time they're doing it because they're taking too long and I just want to get to the point, right? And there's all sorts of different reasons why. But if someone is, and I've done this with, first of all, the first thing you have to do is raise self-awareness. If we go back to that emotional intelligence model, a lot of people don't realize how often they're interrupting others or finishing their sentences. So in a coaching session, I will record it and I'll record it and then I'll play it back to them. And when they hear themselves interrupting me over and over and over, it's like a light bulb goes on. And that's why I talk about, sometimes the biggest improvement in your career comes from unlearning bad habits rather than learning some new communication skill. Because if you have something that's kind of career limiting because you do it so much and it's really hurting you, your ability to become aware of that and come up with ways to overcome it. So what I'll literally do is after I make them aware and I let them listen to the video and then they'll see themselves doing it. Then for the rest of the session, I will say, you have to count to 3 every time I finish speaking before you can say anything back. And it's like torture for them.
Oh, I'm sure.
I mean, they're like, that is so painful. But they start to realize that every time I'm speaking, they want to finish the sentence or they want to cut me off. And it starts to develop the awareness and then they use that same tactic when they go back in the workplace. They'll count to 3 in their head before they respond. And the rule is you cannot respond until that person finishes speaking.
Yeah. And I love how you just explained that too, of the, I'm going to butcher your words again, but basically that sometimes the most impactful thing can be unlearning bad habits, as opposed to trying to learn new habits. And I think so many times people are thinking about, what should I be improving on? Like, what should I be doing better? What should I be adopting? It's just kind of like, I don't know, for me, and I think for most people, it's a more tangible, it feels more tangible, for lack of a better term, of like, what do I need to add into my quiver? You know what I mean? What skill do I need to learn? Yeah. What thing do I need to improve on? And again, it's coming back to this recurring theme of self-awareness. Yeah. Which, darn it, that's the basis of all this. But the unlearning bad habits can be more effective than learning, than adding an arrow to your quiver. It's a fascinating thing to consider, because I don't know. It's also, I think, it requires way more. Well, it's self-awareness, but that self-assessment stuff of like becoming acutely in tune with your weaknesses, or the things that even, because, and I think for so many people, especially and that's why I'm so fascinated with this culturally learned communication habits, is it's so normal. It's so comfortable. Yeah. Like that's the way it's always been. Like that it is, like, I think there's an argument that it would be, it's the most core of communication styles and personalities, even for so many people, especially that nucleus family, dynamic of it. Like, I don't know. I just think that realizing how impactful unlearning that can be, I think is a powerful moment, because then you can let you reflect and learn the things that you have to, like, I've never considered the things I should unlearn.
One of the original titles I chose for this book was Unlearning. And then I realized that's only a piece of it, and I needed to be much broader.
Right. And because it is a piece of the bigger picture, but unlearning.
But let me give you another thing to keep in mind, right? Unlearning is much harder than learning a new skill.
Oh, exponentially.
Because you think about it, if you've been interrupting people for your entire life up until the moment you realize how often you're doing it, and you go through coaching or whatever it is and you discover this, you don't undo 20, 30 years of doing this habit and see it go away overnight, right? And that's why, throughout the book, I give assessments to help people identify what they are. I also encourage them to give those assessments to other people, to let other people verify that they see the same habits. And then once they know what they are, then the unlearning can take a very long time. Yeah. An example that I'll use, when I was I was in college still, and I took my first presentation skills class, and I wanted to get into communication skills. So I was all excited, and I was presenting, and in the middle of the presentation, the professor cuts me off, and he says, "Michael, I have to cut you off because you're saying so many times when you present. It's causing me to not even hear what you're saying. So what I'm going to do for the rest of your presentation, I'm going to raise my hand every time you say which is equivalent of what I do in my coaching session." Right? So I'm sitting there presenting, and at one point, I got more nervous because now I saw how often. And at one point, he started using both hands to show how many ums, and then he stopped again. He said, "Okay, Michael, I'm going to let you just continue. I just wanted to make you aware." And I was horrified, right? But once I learned that, I spent years working on using less ums when I present. And in the book, I have one example of, one of the things you can do if you say a lot is, or any kind of filler speech when you're presenting, you can practice conversations with just everyday conversations with family, friends, whatever, and deliberately reducing your amount of filler speech in your regular conversations that will eventually translate to your presentations. Because what we do in our presentations is exactly what we do in our conversations. Right. If you're saying, like a lot of people say like, and they do it constantly when they're just talking to a friend. But when you're talking to your friend, if you work on saying like less, you will start to eventually say like less when you're in an actual presentation. Yeah. But it takes a long time and a lot of work and a lot of persistence. So I always tell people, look, work on this, but don't beat yourself up when you do it a lot. And the goal is not to get rid of them completely. The goal is to make it least noticeable to others So it's not a distraction anymore.
Right. It's so funny because, it's so uncomfortable to have that like self-reflecting, look back. I listen to my podcasts sometimes, and I don't listen to all of them, but I watch or listen to, most of them, some of them. And what I've realized, and one of the things I've worked on, it's funny because I told you how much I appreciated your compliment this morning before our conversation about hosting. It's so funny because you watch it, and one of the things I learned about myself, and it probably relates to larger communication habits, is my mind goes faster than my mouth. And so I end up dragging on the questions, and then I don't know how to conclude it. So I say, and things like that, like over and over again, and it drives me nuts. And so when I watch it, it's so uncomfortable. Like having to, and I think that's what we're getting at is like, the unlearning process is so much more difficult than the learning of a new thing because it forces self-reflection. And you've got to be critical of yourself. You also have to be open-minded and confident enough to acknowledge that you have flaws and that you're not perfect and things like that. But because you're dealing with things that are core to who you are. It's funny. I hired a few. I've mentioned that we're in scale mode right now, and so I've hired some sales reps, and they've been observing my meetings with my clients, and I'm the best. Right? I'm perfect. I'm the guy. You can learn from me on everything. And we were looking back at a recording on one because he had some ideas about some projects that he wanted. And so we've got these really cool AI note takers, and it records the meeting and whatever. And so there's like these parts of it where you can click what it was, and it brings up the video recording about it. And I interrupted him. And I was like, man, it was so hard for me to watch. And in fact, now that you're saying this, there's, obviously the exercises in the book and, coaching and things like that. But honestly, so much of it is just paying attention to, your real life, like watching these meeting recordings or, watching back on a podcast. Because he almost gave me more. And he would have had I given him the space for it, which would have then increased, it would have benefited the sales process.
Right.
But I was so excited that I just was like, and it was like, and when I watched it back, it was like, man, it's wild.
But the fact that you're saying this reinforces why when I teach presentation skills, absolute requirement, you must record yourself.
Yeah.
Because I can tell you all sorts of things I notice in giving you feedback. And I spent 12 years doing this at the University of Utah, teaching in their MBA program and their physicians program and their other programs. But when you see yourself on tape, the light just kicks on.
Yeah.
Right. And no matter what I say to you, there's times where I'll watch a video and I'll count how many times they say a filler word. And I said, I stopped at 3 minutes in and you had already said 100 times.
Right.
And they're like, no way. And they look at it on tape and they're like, holy crap, And so there is no better learning tool than hearing yourself on tape. Anyone that has to give presentations regularly, I encourage them to record one or two of them and go back and watch it. It's never fun.
No.
It can be painful, but you will get better much faster.
Yeah. Because you never get to watch yourself. Like you never get to observe your communication styles. And we have these built-in biases because of the culturally learned habits that it's normal. I mean, it's got to be one of the most challenging things to unpack.
Well, and ego plays a role too. Like a lot of times our egos prevent us from hearing feedback objectively.
Right.
And some of that's protection, it's emotional intelligence. We feel
we didn't even get to the inner critic.
Yeah. But you have to overcome that inner voice in order to allow yourself to hear feedback. The greatest leaders I've ever seen are constantly looking for feedback. And because they want to know how they're being perceived by others. That's how you increase your self-awareness. That's how you can improve all your other areas of emotional intelligence.
What are good ways to get feedback? If you're a leader?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing, if you're recording any of the presentations, go back and look at them. But the most important thing is get feedback from people that you trust will give you direct feedback and won't sugarcoat it. Now, that also requires you being able to hear it without getting defensive.
Right.
But the people that communicate with you the most are the ones who are going to know what your habits are. And if you are creating an environment where they feel comfortable giving you that feedback and you're asking for it and they know you genuinely appreciate it, that's where you're going to get it from.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell me more. Tell me about, where can people find the book? Tell me about, and I know that we're like, right on the edge of it being available and stuff like that. But for people listening, and I would love to include it, in the show notes, and where can we find it and dig deeper?
Yeah, and well, the title is Leadership Accelerators, and it's called High Impact, and the subtitle is High Impact Communication Skills. It's Strengthen Relationships and Drive Results. I will be putting it live on Amazon probably in September.
Awesome.
And I'm self-publishing it initially just because I want to be able to have it available, but at some point maybe someone else will pick it up and make it bigger. But it's, for me, it's about getting to that finish line. And I've been doing these coaching skills and doing, all these things for so many years. And I want to increase the impact I can have on others. And this doesn't require, if you buy the book, it doesn't require you to do anything other than be committed to your own development.
Yeah.
And I will give you the assessments, the tools, the activities you can do to grow your skills in this book. They're all there. But I'll tell you, these 3 areas of leadership, if you can get really good at knowing your own personality needs, reading the personality needs of others and responding in a way that meets those needs, if you can get really good at knowing your communication habits, the culturally learned habits, leveraging the strengths and minimizing the weaknesses, that's critical too. And then developing your emotional intelligence, the research shows the higher you go in the organization, the more critical it is to your success.
Yeah.
This book will give you the tools to assess yourself and the tools to help you grow your skills in each of those areas. And so it'll be available sometime in September, most likely on Amazon. And that's what I'm excited about.
Yeah, perfect. In the meantime, what I'll do is I'm going to link to your website. But once that's available, that'll also be in the show notes. And I'm going to do just like the shameless plug, like the honest shout out. But every time I get to interact with you, I have meaningful takeaways. I mean, it is so fun. I've obviously gotten, and I didn't read the entirety of it, but I did get to, consume most of the book, and then presentations that I've gotten to sit in from you, and workshops, and, now however many hours of one-on-one conversations. And I just got to say, it's so fun. Like getting to, and knowing now that all the stuff that's in your head is on paper somewhere, it's exciting, and I know that it'll be actionable and impactful for people. So Michael, thank you so much, and you know the drill, but you're inspiring by example. And I'll tell you, we got improved. This is some new material on it, so you'll like it. I know it's your second shirt. I know it's not as cool as the first one. Super
soft. I like it.
It's a nicer, softer one. But I mean it sincerely. You really are inspiring by example, and it's so fun to know. And you touch on it so many times throughout the book too. Of like, you're not just up here. You're not just up here or in the book or wherever, but spouting these things. You've lived them. And there's these personal stories and the anecdotes and all of that stuff. So it's cool to see that. Because where you've evolved and how your career has grown, and then now teaching people those same things, because you've got this perfect balance of the formal education, obviously, the training and what you do as a business. I mean, your services that you offer, but then also you've lived it, and kind of you're a case study for a lot of these things too. And so you tie that all together, and it's just so fun to. So I'm so appreciative of when I get to pick your brain.
A lot of the examples I'm giving you here, I mean, a couple of them might have been in the book, but I tried to include as many examples as I could to make it real for people.
Yeah.
And so I was excited to be able to do that. Every chapter has multiple stories.
Yeah, and that's what makes it it's so easy then to tie it into real life because of that. So Anyway, Michael, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thoroughly enjoy the opportunity every time I get it, and this won't be the last. So
I hope not. It's a lot of fun meeting with you as well, and I enjoy the way you engage. It makes it really easy for me to just be myself and do what I need to do to get the message out to people. So
thank you.